Hello friends, and welcome to Ariel's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. The name of my YouTube channel has just changed from Jocelyn to Ariel. I am still Jocelyn, but I'm in the process of marketing a book and I'm trying to consolidate all my branding so that there is only one name to market. And since my biggest following is on Twitter, where I'm Ariel Anderson, I wanted to change my YouTube channel to also be Ariel Anderson so that agents and publishers can see my full following, because it helps market books apparently. So I only just learned that, so I've been doing it all wrong for 16 years and I've just found out. I'm in Ireland this week on the west coast. I'd actually already shot my YouTube video for this month, which is about how to marry a fetish model. Obviously a subject that many of you will care about excessively, but something even more important happened earlier this week, because for the first time in my career I walked out of a shoot. I made a short video about it and put it on Twitter, so I wanted to make a video to expand on it, just to do everything I can to make sure that this sort of situation happens to the minimum possible number of models in the future, and that if it does happen to any of you, you might be a little better equipped to deal with it as a result of what I'm going to say. So I actually wrote myself a script because I wanted to be as clear as possible. So I'm going to be auto-cueing off my laptop, which is just down here. I don't want to overstate the danger, and I'm also aware that what happened to me was not a particularly egregious example of a photographer trying to abuse his position to treat a model badly, but it's quite a typical example, so I hope that it will be useful as an illustration of what kind of thing predatory men posing as photographers do and what we can do about it as models. So I'm going to get started now. So last week I walked out of a photo shoot halfway through for the first time in over 16 years of being a professional model. Honestly, it's not the first time I should have done so, it's just the first time that I was brave enough to do so. My reason for walking out was mundane and will be familiar to most professional models. The photographer persistently tried to persuade me to pose in ways that would have made for more explicit pictures than I wanted to participate in making. I work up to full frontal nude. The photographer on this occasion was trying to get me to do explicit open leg nude, and while I've got nothing against the genre, it's not what I advertise. The process of deciding to leave and then doing so was both frightening and stressful in ways that I wasn't expecting, and I wanted to make a video to help other models in making the same decision should you need to. So I'm going to talk about what the warning signs were during the shoot and why I felt able to leave. Obviously every situation is different, and I don't mean to blame other models who've not walked out of bad shoots. I've been one of those models in the past, but if I can help, I want to. So here's everything I learned about this experience. Looking back at the communications between the photographer and me, there were several warning signs, both before the shoot and during the shoot, so I want to talk you through them. First of all, I'd worked with this photographer before. In my experience, bad shoots, which are unusual, are no less likely with people we've worked with before, but we tend to feel safer, which predators perhaps use to their advantage. My first shoot with this man had been at a studio where the studio owner had been present all day. It had been perfectly normal and pleasant. I'd left the photographer a positive reference on Purpleport, which is the platform that he booked me through, and everything had seemed perfectly normal. The first warning sign in hindsight was that when he rebooked me, he asked about working with me in a different location. That in itself is not unusual, but having a studio owner in attendance does make for a safer environment. I agreed because he explained that he wanted a more domestic location for this shoot. He initially mentioned booking a hotel suite and then later changed his mind to booking a holiday cottage. Deciding on a more isolated location for the shoot was possibly a second warning sign, but I still wasn't suspicious. Then a few weeks later, with a date booked, he emailed again to ask me to confirm that I'd be happy to work to all my levels at our shoot. This for me encompasses a wide range of work, from fully clothed fashion to artistic nude to hard BDSM. All of these activities aren't actually available to everyone who books me, since for safety reasons I only shoot BDSM with people who can prove that they're skilled and experienced, and furthermore, because shooting BDSM can be a more intimate experience than a regular photo shoot, I decide to take these shoots on a case-by-case basis. So I replied that I would work up to the levels I advertise on Purpleport, the platform he was booking me through. He'd expressed absolutely no interest in BDSM, but to cover all my bases, I explained that if he was interested in shooting bondage-themed images, he'd need to hire a rigger, and that I could help him find one if that's what he wanted to do. Asking models to confirm the levels they work up to is no bad thing, but when they clearly state the work they're happy to do on their portfolio, as I do, Anyone displaying any extra interest in the far limits of what a model's happy to be doing is probably worth being extra cautious around. His reply to me was probably another warning sign. He wrote that he'd leave BDSM to those who knew what they were doing, since the excitement would probably be too much for him. Now, this isn't how photographers with a professional attitude generally talk. They don't anticipate being excited by shoots. But I assumed that he was embarrassed that I brought up a genre that he'd had no intention of shooting, and he was trying to make a joke of it because he felt uncomfortable, so I didn't heed the warning sign. All the other communications pre-shoot were completely normal, just giving location details and making clothing requests. Then on the day of the shoot, I arrived to find him in a slightly kind of overwrought, overexcited state. He skipped between conversational topics with quite disquieting speed, and kept standing up and sitting down again in different places. He asked me if I wanted cake. I said no thank you. He gave me some anyway. And he kept talking about having a nice relaxed day, but seemed the absolute opposite of relaxed. I'm used to new photographers being nervous, but since he'd met me before, his behaviour did concern me a little, to be honest. Then, when we started shooting, he immediately began making complimentary comments about my legs and my eyes. Like most photographers, when they're complimenting a model, tend to confine themselves to saying a pose works well or that an expression is good, rather than saying things like, oh, nice legs, oh, sexy face, looking at you, such a treat. So when he started talking like this, I did start wondering whether we were going to have some issues with boundaries. It was then that it first occurred to me that I might need to speak to him about how he was behaving, which isn't something I normally have to do at shoots at all. Having not directed me at all for the first 20 minutes of posing, he suddenly asked me to open my legs as wide as possible, which in itself wasn't a problem. I was in a dress and I was wearing panties. However, since it was the first bit of direction in the entire shoot, it struck me as a little peculiar. Shortly afterwards, he asked me to take my panties off, and I worked in nude, so that in itself wasn't a problem. But I was suspicious that it was a preamble to his trying to get me to repeat the legs apart pose, but without underwear, simply because it's the only specific pose that he'd requested in the entire shoot. As a result, when he did ask for exactly that, I was ready to explain to him that I didn't work up to explicit open leg nude. I gave him the benefit of the doubt and assumed that he'd forgotten, but I reminded him that we'd discussed the fact that I only worked up to full frontal nude in email before the shoot. He apologised, and I hoped that the issue wouldn't come up again for the rest of the day. When a photographer who hasn't been giving much direction suddenly becomes micromanaging about a specific pose, in my experience, it's often when they're trying to get something more explicit than the model is comfortable with. Sadly, I've seen it before, and I do tend to see it as a warning sign. So 20 minutes later, he suddenly said he wanted to shoot some BDSM. Once again, this was something I'd specifically said no to during the pre-shoot communications, so I reminded him that I'd said if he wanted to do that, he'd have to hire a rigger to do the bondage. Oh, sorry, he replied in exactly the same tone that he'd used for his previous apology, in a kind of automated way. I felt suspicious that he wasn't really absorbing my replies at this point. He brought out a spreader bar and Velcro cuffs for my wrists and ankles. At this point, I should have refused because I'd said no to it, and by going back on what I'd said, I guess I showed weakness, really. But I fell into the trap of feeling quite sorry for him because he'd obviously bought these items specifically for the shoot, only to have me refuse to wear them. So I said that depending on what he had in mind, I'd pose in them since they don't require any skill to put on and since I know that they're easy to escape from, unlike quite a lot of other restraints. However, it was a warning sign that I shouldn't have ignored. Out of all the fetish items that he could have chosen to buy, like handcuffs, ball gags, collars, chains, he'd chosen the one item specifically designed to hold someone's legs apart, which, now looking back, I think is quite indicative of his state of mind. And given that we'd already had a discussion about open leg poses, it did seem quite suspicious. However, spreader bars are a popular item and I've worn them many times with many photographers on my own and I've never had any problems. So, given that I was a little bit suspicious of him by this point, I did explain that either I needed to be wearing underwear for these poses or I'd need to angle my body so that I was diagonally away from him to avoid making the shot more explicit than I'd be comfortable with. He agreed and apologised again when I reiterated that he couldn't stand where he'd moved to because it would make for too explicit an image. And it's worth saying at this point that I don't want to give the impression that this whole shoot experience was about my vagina, because actually I don't particularly care about explicit shots or not. I have done relatively explicit work from time to time when I've thought that the project warranted it, when I felt comfortable enough with the photographer and comfortable enough with the subject matter. I'm not actually particularly obsessed with keeping my legs together, but I didn't like the feeling that I was being coerced into doing something I'd explicitly said I didn't want to do, and there was no reason why I should have done it. There are models all over Purpleport who are happy working to open leg, and if he'd wanted that he could have booked that, and he didn't, so I didn't feel inclined to have him pushing my levels when he really clearly had very little in the way of a clear idea of what he wanted to get from the shoot. So, in my opinion, the fact that he appeared to primarily want maximally explicit images just made me very suspicious about what else he was looking for out of this day with me. I did think it was worth pointing out that that's not what I've been engaged for. He attached my ankles and wrists to the spreader bar, and then he joked that he could decide to sit and eat breakfast and I wouldn't be able to stop him, and that if he wanted he could just leave the cottage and leave me there tied up. Now, this is extremely poor bondage etiquette. I may have been playing a captive for the pictures, but I wasn't his captive. I'm a professional model and I was posing in restraints he'd asked me to wear. Concerned that he was indulging in his fantasy rather than remembering that we were in a professional shoot, I replied that I was perfectly alright because I could get myself out of the restraints without assistance. To prove the point, I unclipped my wrists from the bar to show him. He replied that, oh, you must feel very vulnerable, you need a lot of trust to do bondage shoots. And again, feeling that perhaps this was actually part of his fantasy, I replied that I didn't feel vulnerable at all, which I didn't, although I felt quite annoyed. The attempt to introduce this kind of element of dirty talk into the shoot, really, was another warning sign, and it was now, at this point, that I started considering the possibility of leaving the shoot if he continued to be inappropriate. During a break, I texted my husband and let him know that that was something that I might be having to do, I think to make myself accountable, because having said it to someone else made me feel like there was no excuse for not doing it if I felt like I had to. Having reiterated that I could escape from the restraints, I began posing. He kept repeating the fact that he was glad I could escape. Oh, actually, I'm really glad you can escape. Actually, I don't mind at all that you can escape. It's just for the look of the thing. Oh, I'm glad you can get out. He said it so much that I began to suspect that he was actually thinking the opposite. He also started asking me questions about some of the harder BDSM shoots that I've done and asking whether I ever felt in danger. Again, I suspected he wanted an answer that would give him some kind of thrill, so I replied truthfully that I never feel in danger and that I only shoot harder BDSM with people I consider to be friends. In another really bizarre conversational turn, he then claimed that the spreader bar and restraints weren't actually bondage equipment, but just things he'd bought to use in the gym. This was nonsense. I ignored him. Then he asked if he could blindfold me. I agreed, but I said I'd put it on myself as an excuse to show him again how easily I could get out of the restraints. I also wanted to place the blindfold so that I could see under it, since I didn't really trust him to keep to the angles that we'd agreed to him shooting from. Once I placed the blindfold, I realised that he wasn't actually photographing me. I looked underneath it and I could see that he was just sitting drinking his tea at the dining table and watching me. By this point I was actually quite perturbed by his behaviour, and I decided to myself that if he said or did anything else inappropriate that I'd just leave immediately. I unclipped my wrists again, I took the blindfold off and I told him I'd wait until he was ready to start shooting, whereupon he finally picked up his camera again. I reattached my wrists to the spreader bar and pulled the blindfold back down, and I watched his feet as he moved from the place we'd agreed he could shoot from to right in front of me, the place where I'd said the picture would be too explicit. As it happens, it wasn't. When I told him that, I'd not been expected to be crouched over with my wrists also attached to the spreader bar. This made the shoot acceptably non-explicit for me, but evidently he'd crept around while I was blindfolded in the hope that he'd get a shot that I'd not agreed to. Having discovered that the shot wasn't explicit after all, he directed me to lie back. This would have made the shot that he wanted to take extremely explicit, because I'd have been flipped over onto my back with my ankles and wrists kind of behind my head. There was absolutely no way I'd have done that. But it was the final bit of evidence that I needed that he wasn't thinking straight at all. He was hell-bent on getting a gynecological picture that I'd explicitly told him multiple times that I didn't want to pose for, and which he could easily have booked another model to shoot, since there are many excellent models, as I've said, who'd be happy to do more explicit poses, although they might charge more correctly. It also told me that having failed to get my consent to pose like this by honest means, he'd been happy to resort to subterfuge. The spreader bar and blindfold editions had been a setup to circumnavigate my consent, and if he was happy to do this, I was very suspicious of what else he'd maybe planned for the day. So I snapped the ring connecting the spreader bar to the ankle cuff on one side, I wrenched my ankle out of the other cuff, and I removed the rest of the bondage. I told him that I'd already explained multiple times that I wasn't happy to work beyond my advertised levels, and that he'd repeatedly tried to get me to do poses that I didn't want to do. He apologised again in the weird automatic way he'd been doing all morning. So I went into the bedroom, I packed all my clothes up, I got dressed first, I picked up my handbag, and at this point I did consider just leaving without going back through the open plan living room, because I judged that the most risky thing I could do at this point was to confront him. The reason I was particularly worried about that was because he was in the living area, which was where the kitchen was, and there was a knife block out on the kitchen counter, so as far as I knew they were the only potential weapons in the apartment, but I wasn't sure if confronting him was a good idea, and it did occur to me it might feel safer just to leave without saying goodbye. But I didn't think he was actually dangerous. I'm taller than him, I'm younger than him, I'm very likely more agile. I held my handbag in front of me kind of like a shield just in case he took leave of his senses and tried to stab me, and I mentally rehearsed leaving my suitcase behind if I needed to quickly make an escape. I think the reason I wanted to explain to him why I was leaving rather than just sneaking out as though I'd done something wrong was that he'd done something wrong. I wanted to make it less likely that he'd ever do this to another model again, even if I didn't succeed in getting him taken off the networking platforms later, which actually I have managed to do. I found myself thinking of my nieces who are the age of the youngest models entering my industry, and how angry I'd be if I knew that someone had treated them like this and repeatedly tried to get them to do something they didn't want to do, and abused the fact that they were being paid. And I thought of the young models entering my industry today, and how little I want them to experience this thing that, although it's rare, we all know the term level pushing in my industry, because from time to time there'll be photographers or people who enter this industry with the intention of doing exactly this to young women. And I'm aware that as an established model, new models will look at my behaviour and they will be influenced by it. And I want to be a good influence. And I thought of the younger versions of myself who let myself be put in danger and insulted and coerced by a small number of predatory photographers who see courtesy as weakness. And I have always wanted to be polite, and I have always wanted to offer good customer service, and I've always wondered if I was being oversensitive or misreading situations when I felt uncomfortable at work. But now I'm 42 years old, I've got almost 17 years experience of being a full-time model, and I didn't want to get stabbed, but I will not put up with this kind of twattery anymore, and I won't have my field of specialisation, which is BDSM, used against me in an attempt to make me work beyond my levels. I won't allow any photographer who behaves like this to tell himself that I left because of my own personal problems. So I told him that I was leaving. I told him that it's never acceptable to repeatedly direct a model into poses she's explained she's not happy to do, and I told him that resorting to subterfuge makes it even less acceptable, and I told him that by adding bondage elements to the shoot, it had been even more important that he'd respected my consent. He tried to get between me and the door, but probably not deliberately, he was just floundering around, so I retreated to the doorway so that he couldn't do that. He apologised again, I left, and I drove until I was a couple of miles away before I stopped to calm down a bit and to make the video that's on Twitter. It was only later that I realised I'd left my shoes behind, so although I thought I was in this calm and controlled state, I really wasn't. I'd probably never been in danger from him. I think probably what he was hoping for was some sort of seductive day in which he got some sort of sexual contact with the model. Probably rape, murder and battery were not on his mind at all. It's just that, of course, once someone is behaving in a way that you don't find rational or respectful, of course you do start to consider the worst possibilities. So, here in summary are some of the warning signs I think we can look out for as models. So, a photographer being especially concerned about privacy at a shoot, certainly. Any preoccupation with levels of nudity, A look at your portfolio should tell them what they need to know about what you're happy to do. So make sure your portfolio notes make that clear, because I think it minimises your chance of having to have this kind of conversation. A photographer seeming especially nervous, protesting too much about not wanting to shoot explicit images, or being overly personally complimentary. Another warning sign, I think, is a photographer who doesn't normally offer much direction suddenly beginning to micromanage a specific pose at the top end of your modelling levels. Unexpected elements being added to the shoot, like the bondage in my experience. Any sign that your pre-shoot stipulations are being ignored. Any repeated attempts to circumnavigate your levels by any means. It's perfectly reasonable, and parenthetically, to ask why, if I've been in situations where I should have left shoots before, it's taken me this long to actually walk out of one. So here are the reasons that I felt as though I finally could. I know that not all of these reasons are possible for every model, but the more of them that you can have in place, the less vulnerable you'll be to this sort of thing happening to you. The first is that I had my own transport. If I'd needed to wait outside the cottage for a taxi, I'd have been scared he was going to come after me. And if I'd needed him to take me to a train station, that's even worse. I'd have probably been too scared to tell him I wanted to finish prematurely. If you can, learn to drive and take your car to any shoots where you'll be alone with a photographer. It was so comforting just to be able to get in my own car and take myself out of the situation. Secondly, I had enough money to get home without the shoot payment. The further from home you are, the more funds you need in your account, and you need them readily available. Number 3, and it's related, is that I didn't need his money from the shoot. It's very hard to walk out when the shoot fee is how you're planning to pay your next rent payment. As soon as you start modelling, therefore, I think it's really important to start saving, because in this kind of situation, money is power. The richer you are, the easier it is to forfeit a day's or even a week's fee if you need to. 4, and this is unusual for me, I'd taken a deposit. This guy had paid a third of my fee up front because he'd previously cancelled at short notice. And if I'm honest, it was easier to leave, knowing that I'd at least covered my travel expenses. I hope I'd have still left, but I know it's difficult to do when you're self-employed. Forfeiting the money you'd banked on making is not easy at all, and anything that makes it harder for you to leave puts you at a disadvantage. 5, and again, it's related to money, and I don't want you to think I'm obsessed with material things, but I have discovered the way in which having money gives you choices. So number 5 is that I have other sources of income now. That wasn't the case when I was a new model. In fact, it's only been the case for the last 5 years or so. But on this particular day, I left my shoot and I went home and I shot a custom video for one of my favourite customers. I hope I'd have still left if I'd not had another way to make money that day, but there's no denying that having a second income stream, like OnlyFans or ManyVids or Clips for Sale or webcam or custom videos, it makes you so much less vulnerable, and it makes the decision to leave feel much lower stakes. 6 is that I managed to think beyond myself. Now, I have to be honest, I've not always succeeded at this. I think it's very easy as a model, if you have a bad experience, to assume it was something about you. So probably the worst experience in my career, it never occurred to me that he'd do it to anyone else, because I thought he'd chosen me because of my spanking work. I thought that he just judged me to be a bit of a slut because I was happy to appear on camera with a man. So although I left him a negative reference at the time, and I did warn other models about him, I didn't take as many steps as I wish I had done now, because it never occurred to me that he would treat other models the way he treated me. And unfortunately he did, and he used the pictures that he'd taken of me as evidence to force another model into a situation she wasn't comfortable with. So I've not always managed to think sufficiently cleverly beyond myself, but now I realise that a photographer who treats you badly today will go on to do it again, armed with the knowledge and experience he's gained from successfully taking advantage of you. You can refuse to work with him again, but that won't help all the other models. So by articulating why you won't work with him again, either at the time like I did, or if that feels too dangerous, in a message afterwards, you'll maybe make him rethink his behaviour. Afterwards, I left him a negative reference and reported him to Purpleport, and now he's been removed from the platform. I've privately messaged models who've previously worked with him in order to warn them in case he has another means of contacting them. And in the aftermath, quite a lot of very kindly intentioned people on social media asked why models like me put themselves in these dangerous situations. Now, I would argue that we don't put ourselves in any more danger than all the other professionals who work one-to-one in private with members of the public every day, like plumbers and carers and private tutors and cleaners and estate agents and gardeners and building contractors and personal trainers. It's true that models tend to be relatively attractive to their customers and they tend to take at least some of their clothes off. But in my experience, the fact that many of our clients find us on some level attractive actually means that they tend to treat us extra well rather than extra badly. And we also have the advantage that plumbers, for example, do not have of being able to check references for clients with our peers. And I don't accept the argument that we should expect to be abused because of the job we do. It's not a normal part of my job. The fact that this sort of situation has happened to me roughly once every 4 years in my career seems to bear that out. So here's my diary from my last tour, which included this incident, as illustration, because I think it's important not to overstate these risks. Here's my tour. First of all, on the 9th of March, I worked one-to-one in a hotel room with a photographer I'd never met before. It was an absolute pleasure. There was never a moment where I felt at risk. 10th of March, I worked in a house with my 2 friends, Zoe and Dodgy David, all day. Everything was lovely. There was no sexual assault. On the 11th to 13th of March, I worked with a professional glamour photography company perfectly safely. On the 14th of March, I worked on my own in a house with a photographer and his wife. There was no sexual assault. They were lovely. Then I took a couple of days off for my birthday. Then I worked in a studio where the studio owner was in a separate office all day with a photographer. Hello, Colfett. I was perfectly safe all day. Then I worked alone with 2 different photographers on the 18th of March. Everything was lovely. That evening I worked alone in an apartment with a photographer. Everything was absolutely a joy. On the 19th of March I spent all day in an apartment on my own with a photographer shooting bondage and spanking and simulated sexual activity, and I've never felt more safe or comfortable in my life. The next day I worked with 3 kinky professionals, hello Dodgy David again, and the Havering Collection, where I was getting spanked, and I've never felt more safe or comfortable either. On the 21st I worked alone with a female producer in her house. Everything was absolutely fine. I had a cancellation on the 22nd. On the 23rd, I had an idiot, which is the man I've just been talking about, and I walked out. I'm absolutely fine. On the 24th, I went back to work, working alone from home with a photographer who did bondage, including blindfolds and spreader bars with me. I was absolutely fine. On the 25th, I worked alone with no studio owner in attendance with 3 photographers, so I was outnumbered 3-1. I felt perfectly safe all the time. And then yesterday, I travelled to Ireland. This job is not full of danger. Unfortunately, it does have the potential to go very badly wrong on the very occasional occasion that you get a predatory photographer. So, in conclusion, I made this video because I wanted to try to encourage other models to leave a shoot if they don't feel safe. I don't mean that you should do it in the way that I did if it doesn't feel like the safest option. If faking an illness or pretending to get bad news or just sneaking out during a break feels safest, just do it. And here are some other ways to stay safe that I employ. Make sure someone knows where you are. My husband has access to my online diary, so he has the address of all my shoots. We also have an app that tracks my whereabouts, assuming that my phone's on me. So make sure someone knows when you should be out of your shoot and where you are. If you're feeling unsure, keep important items packed up so that if you need to leave in a hurry, you don't need to waste your time locating things like your phone and your purse that you won't want to leave behind. I think any impediment to your just leaving gives you a disadvantage. Where possible, keep things near the door that you'd exit from. I was really grateful that, as it happens, the bedroom where I was changing was near the exit to the flat. It did make things feel better. And make sure you know which route you take to leave the building. I know sometimes when we're working in large studio complexes, it can actually be quite hard to remember which way you came in, so just stay aware as you enter the building of how you'd get out again. And if you start to feel things aren't going well, I definitely recommend sending a message to warn someone who cares about you that you might need help. I texted my husband an hour before I left to let him know that I potentially was going to need to leave at short notice, and I did feel safer knowing that he'd been alerted to the possibility. And rehearse your plan. By chance, on my way over to this shoot, I was thinking about what I'd do if one of my worst shoot experiences were to be repeated. I'd thought through getting dressed before packing my clothes, having all my valuables in one place, knowing where the front door was, being prepared to use physical force if someone tried to block my exit, and phoning for help. It was, as it happened, immensely helpful to have those things clearly in my mind. Now, I know that I've got an advantage over some models because I'm tall, because I'm well established as well, and because my voice sounds quite scary to quite a lot of people. But what all models have in our favour is the element of surprise. No pervy photographers ever expect us to just walk out. I can't tell you how shocked my photographer looked when I did it, and I guess I can tell you how very satisfying that was. He hadn't managed to muster a sentence together, let alone act actually tried to stop me before I was out of the building. So remember that it's the last thing they expect you to do, and that gives you a massive advantage. I do have to be honest, I also know that there are situations that would have made it harder for me to do the same thing. If the photographer had been much better known than me, for example, I might have felt more intimidated, or if he'd been physically threatening or much bigger than me, I don't know if I'd have done things quite the same way, and I certainly wouldn't blame any other model for not doing it, but I do at least want to suggest it to you as an option for the future, because now, having done it, I feel safer than I've ever felt, because now I think I'd have a better chance of doing it again. And I think that when we can trust ourselves to be our own best friends, we feel stronger. And I also think that when we as models work together to point out to photographers when they're behaving inappropriately and to warn each other, I think we can make ourselves not only feel safer but objectively be safer. Please, anyone who's got any questions or wants any help or wants to know who this photographer was, please email me on Kinky Ariel Anderson. That's KINKY ARIELANDERSSEN @gmail.com, and I will do my best to get back to you. I really hope that was some help. As I've said, I don't blame anyone for not managing to do what I did the other day. I have failed to do it in the past, as I said, but I know that the regrets I have for not having the courage to do it earlier in my career, I'll carry those regrets with me forever. Not because I was harmed, but because on a couple of occasions those photographers went on to repeat their behaviour. And the feeling I have now, knowing that that photographer will never be able to use Purple Port to book a model again, and I will keep an eye on whether he opens up a portfolio anywhere else, and if he does, I will shut him down. That feeling does give me more trust in myself and makes me feel as though I will probably not let anyone take advantage of me again. So I wish very much the same for all of you models out there. And dear photographers, of course we don't all think you're going to do this. The huge majority of my clients, as I hope I just illustrated with my diary, are an absolute delight and would never dream of doing any such thing. It's unfortunate that this kind of thing ever happens, and it doesn't happen often, but probably every professional model will have her own story of this kind of thing happening, and time's up with it, isn't it? Thank you for watching. I'm sorry that was very, very long, but it felt important. I will be back with a much more frivolous video, which I've already made, next month. So, as always, thank you and bye. Bye.